We're back with more Rock is Lit. I'm happy to welcome David Novak to the show. David is Associate Professor of Music at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Director of the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Music. He is the author of the award-winning Japanoise, Music at the Edge of Circulation, which was published in 2013, and the host of Selectric Davyland, a weekly radio program broadcast on KCSB-FM in Santa Barbara. His new book project, Diggers, a media archaeology of global popular music, theorizes musical globalization among networks of record and cassette collectors, informal sound archives, reissue labels, and sound recording digitization projects in Southeast Asia and beyond. Thanks for joining me, David.
Oh, sure. No problem.
The focus of this episode is Ben Arzate's short novel, Music is Over, a surreal horror story that imagines the lost years of musician Juntaro Yamanouchi from the Japanese noise band, the Garo Garo Gay Gay Gay. The book title, of course, comes from Juntaro's recurring saying, "Fuck compose, fuck melody, dedicated to no one, thanks to no one, art is over." And this is one of the quotes in the epigraph. As I understand it from several people, you are the reigning world heavyweight champion when it comes to Japanese noise music. In an email to me, journalist Ed Cunningham called your book Japanoise a seminal book on Japanese noise. Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth said of the book, David Novak goes inside the noise scene and presents an astounding perspective, historically astute, inspired, and completely shell-shocked. So I'm really excited to have you here, especially since I know very little about this type of music.
That's good. I think I don't accept the idea of being an expert in this music, especially being someone who just sort of dipped into it over the years, not someone who's the core of it. And there are, a lot of these people wrote their own books about it. And I might be the one person who's written about it in English, critically, but the gurus are all in Japan mostly. And there are lots of people in the US who know more than me too. So thanks to those guys for their props. But it's funny to think of the word seminal in relation to Gerio. Anyway.
Well, before we jump in, tell me a little bit about how your interest in Japanese culture and music began. Because I know you taught Japanese, or you taught English in Japan for a year in the late 80s.
I dropped out of school. When it began? Yeah, in the late 80s, anyone could do anything because they didn't have the JET program, which is the English language program yet, where they would place people in schools, and the English schools were kind of just casting about for anybody. So someone like me, who didn't even have a college degree yet, could just sort of show up and try to get work. And it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, but and I learned a lot of hard lessons. But as a 19 or 20-year-old, I was kind of thrown into this world that, was full of really different things than I expected. I went to Japan with a lot of ideas about how it would be, coming from textbooks, religious studies. And I was living in Kyoto, this medieval city. And what I found was really different, much more sophisticated, transnational, cosmopolitan, and also, strange in some ways. And I ran into a lot of stuff that was off the map, but not really noise. And I don't think I heard about it until I came back to the United States, because the US was really where this concept took off and especially got applied to Japan. Whereas a lot of people making it in Japan were more like trying to get connected with the experimental, electronic, industrial music scenes of the West.
Well, you were a DJ in college. Mm-hmm. So was that how you came across the music?
Pretty much. Yeah. I was working at WOBC in Ohio, and there were a few records that would come in. You'd say, "What's this?" It'd have no information in English, or it would be really hard. There was no internet. You couldn't find out. No one knew anything about it. And we'd just say, "This crazy stuff is coming from Japan. Check this out." And, we mixed it with all sorts of stuff like, Eskimo records from Folkways, or
oh, wow.
We would just sort of take it as a sound source and mess with it because we were making noise too. Mm-hmm. So, when we got cassettes or CDs from Japan, we kind of dealt with it as a material sound, just this is something that we can relate to because it's out there and it does different things with musical sound, with electronic sound. And the idea of it being something that came from Japanese culture, it didn't matter too much to us. And it wasn't until later that people started sort of really trying to assign Japan to it as Japan became more and more of a presence in the media cultures of the US in the late 80s and early 90s with anime and other kinds of forces of media, Pokemon or whatever, coming into the American consciousness.
Right. But in terms of music, it really was Boredom's album, Soul Discharge, that really introduced you to that world of Japanese noise music that you really had, as you were saying, you had not even really heard of that before.
Yeah, I was living in the same city as those musicians. And I mean, I is from Kyoto, and I didn't have a chance to see, I think once I saw something like that the entire time. But when I saw them in San Francisco at the I-Beam, I think.
Kennel Club.
The Kennel Club, right. And it was a time when there were other bands like Carolina Rainbow in the area. There's a new book out actually about the underground in San Francisco that deals with a lot of this history. And the moments of connection were pretty strong. And it took us a while to realize, oh yeah, these guys are Japanese. They haven't had that much connection with the US. And I could speak Japanese, so occasionally I would come up and start talking to these groups and, who were just trying to deal with the US for the first time. And, with the Boredoms, it was the fact that they toured and they blew people away. And that was a really big deal. Their record was released on Shimmy Disc, which was a label run by Kramer in New York City. And they released a couple of other things that were had been circulating in Japan for years and years. But the things just started to pop up in the sort of early 90s to mid 90s was when it really started becoming a flood of stuff because of the change in the media distribution with CDs and eventually CDRs becoming possible to mail. But before that, it had been pretty underground. And to get it on vinyl, which was a real medium, not like a cassette, which we all thought of as being something that, how can this be released? How can this be on vinyl? And then when you went to see them and you said, oh, these guys are really something else. So Boredom's Ruins were also released on that label. There were other bands that people heard of, but by the time you got to something that was really extreme, what we would consider like harsh noise or extreme noise like Merzbau or Hijo Kaidan or Incapacitance or something like that, you had to be pretty deep in it by that time.
Yeah, I would imagine so. You wrote a piece describing that show at the Kennel Club, and it was a fascinating description of what it was like. Can you talk about that? Was it unlike anything you'd ever seen before, this band playing this chaotic, kind of in-your-face music?
No, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, but it was like a lot of things I had seen before. And so I was pretty involved with groups like Butthole Surfers. I had seen a lot of chaotic and crazy music by the time I got to see the Boredoms. So what the Boredoms were just excellent. They were just amazing, powerful, and explosive. The music that they made was unique because of its aura, because of its authority, and because of its energy. It wasn't like I saw this and said, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. But I said, this is incredible. This is amazing. This really touches me. This really moves me. So I think that it was powerful for that reason. And I had been to Japan, right? And I had kind of a tough experience. And I thought, well, maybe I'll never go back there. I had gone to Indonesia to do my research instead. And I was at that time like pretty involved with my own bands and not really interested in going back to Asia to do research. So it planted a little seed like, well, if I go to Japan, at least I can see a lot more excellent music like this and maybe have a lot more chances to meet people who I never knew were there.
Okay, well, let's talk about the word noise. You wrote in the introduction to the book you co-edited with Matt Sakakini, Keywords in Sound, that, and this is a quote, noise is a material aspect of sound. It is discussed as a generalized property of sound, as noisiness, as a distinct sonic object within music, speech, or environmental sounds, as a noise, or as a totalizing qualifier for emergent styles, e.g., that hip-hop stuff is all noise. But its specific qualities are hard to define, end quote. You also wrote in that intro that, quote, begins again, noise stands for subjectivities of difference that break from normative social context, end quote. So my assumption is that the label Japanese noise music involves more than just sound. So if we take Japanese out of it, tell me more about that word noise and what it reveals about that kind of music.
Well, thank you for taking a deep dive into that complicated, definition, which is,
it's fascinating.
I think, thank you. Well, the term noise, is a really, really complicated and rich one. There's been a lot of ink spilled on it. My perspective on it is sort of broken up into different discourses. So the reason I wrote that article about noise was to show what we mean different things when we say noise. There's the technological, we could start with the technological description, which is something that we don't want to be transmitted is noise. So if I'm talking to you right now over this connection, we don't want anything but the intelligibility of my voice to come through. Maybe some of the sound quality of my voice helps with that, but we're going to compress the hell out of it to make sure that it doesn't get noise in the signal. So there's signal to noise. Then there is something like noise is something I don't like or it's unwanted. And that would be, an assignation of value. Oftentimes it's a cultural value. That's why I use hip hop there, because it tends to be one of those things people say, I like everything except for country and hip hop. In other words, I like, and that extends to the social noise, which is I like everything but poor white people and poor black people's music or something like that. So you get into this kind of problem of, trying to disentangle these different forms of noise from one another. And then we have like the physical materiality of noise, which is, noise is, according to Hermann Helmholtz and the acoustic kind of definition, it's stuff that doesn't repeat. And I found that metaphorically very interesting, right? Because that materiality has a kind of metaphorical purpose, which is to show that when something repeats itself over and over and over, it becomes like a cultural tradition.
Yes.
When a wave repeats itself over and over again, it becomes a tone. But when a sound when a wave is broken and doesn't repeat itself and is unpredictable and has all these differences in the tone, it doesn't come out as a note or a tone. It comes out as like a plate crashing, which if you looked at it on a spectrogram, you'd see all these different sounds. We call that noise. And there's a material difference between that kind of sound and tones. And so there is actually a material connection between what we would call noise and what we would call noise music, this so-called genre, which actually is using these sounds that are noise, they're noisy sounds. And it's worth saying they're noisy. So something like the Boredoms, what was interesting is their music was pretty noisy, but it still had structures in it. And the more repetitions, like repetitions of rhythm, repetitions of tone, or style that it has in it, the less kind of it is like so-called pure noise. And so I got more and more interested in these things where people would say, no, I'm not noise. And so, getting into those things about noise in the US in the 90s, really people started using it as a generic term coming from things like sonic youth, where you would hear, or industrial, music that is often very rhythmic and has a lot of rhythmic repetition, but the melodic or harmonic stuff is taken away or has a punk rock sort of chanting style instead of singing. So there are all these ways in which there are musical and material reasons for calling something noise. And then you have all these other associations piled up on top of it. So it becomes this kind of like cluster of ideas and feelings and sounds that stays together it's not really easy to say, well, that's not what I'm talking about. Actually, I'm only talking about this form of noise. Yes. And so what I find annoying about that problem is that allows people to sort of shift back and forth between these very different contexts as if they're the same thing, just by using the word noise. But they're not the same thing. And it's worth sort of looking at things in context. And a lot of the writing about noise doesn't do that as much as I'd like. So the article was trying to say there are all these different forms and expectations that we put on this concept of this word. And if you break down the genealogy of the word, you can see that what it's doing is sort of forcing together a lot of things that may or may not have associations of those values, that social values or material sound values or technological values that we would associate with them. But they're all part of this thing. Like the fact that there's a lot of misunderstanding is a kind of noise between these cultural sites.
Exactly. I also like that you wrote in that same intro, noise is typically separated from music on the grounds of aesthetic value. So that raises the question then, how do you define music? So it gets very complicated. I thought the intro was really interesting. It really made me think about that word in a different way. And in relation to the music style that we're talking about, I gather that this style, and especially when you couple just the music with the performance, is so much more than just the sound coming out. There's an attitude, there's a certain behavior, there's a certain expectation that the audience has. How would you describe what that style of music is?
So, people are, of course, naturally going to ask the question, what does it sound like? What does this thing sound like? And there's whenever you're talking about something, you can't just be like a post-structuralist about it and say, oh, it's all just discourse, or it's all just people talking and thinking, and there's no real thing there, which is what I kind of do. I kind of think that's true. But there's also, examples that get held up and used all the time. Usually the problem with examples is that it's the same example then everything else kind of floats away from it, and you can do this with any kind of genre, like country music or anything. You kind of look at it and you say, well, these conditions that we say are the origins of the music aren't really consistent at all over history or from case to case. And the sound is different from case to case. But Christy, can I ask you, have you ever heard anything of this music?
Yes. I was listening to Boredom's album, Soul Discharge, on YouTube because of the way you wrote about that record and that band and seeing them live and, what we were talking about earlier. You said of that album, quote, dropping the needle on Soul Discharge released the most spectacularly dissonant racket I'd ever heard, toggling through a spectrum of styles and sounds. Sometimes Boredom sounded like a hardcore band, sometimes a random Dada cut-up of popular culture. It was desperately heavy, but also funny as hell, end quote. And I thought to myself, I got to check this out. And then when I did, I thought, yep, spot on. And I also listened to a lot of Gary Gay on YouTube before I interviewed Ben about his novel Music is Over. Oh, and I listened to Merzbow too. So I have very limited knowledge of this kind of music, but I have had a taste of it.
Great. Well, that's a pretty good taste. And, I guess what I would say is that those are, really different examples, and they sound really different from one another, don't you think?
Yes, I completely agree. There was something almost childlike about Boredom's, but there was something really assaultive about the music of the Gay.
Yeah.
And of course, their stage performances were legendary. What would go on during those shows.
Yeah. And the same with Boredom's, actually, Hanatarashi is probably most famous for, which is the Eyes band before Boredom's. They're probably the most famous for these assaultive performances. In the cover of my book, in the frontispiece of my book, there's a picture by Jin Sato, which is famously of Hanatarashi performing, which was just and he's driving a bulldozer into a club and destroying the club. And I asked him about this picture, this legendary picture, and he said, why do you want to know? And I said, well, actually, I've heard so many stories about this, and you were there, you took the picture, can you tell me about what happened? And I said that what I'm most interested in is how this legend of this powerful assaultive performance got circulated to people who hadn't been there, because that's a really powerful part of this story is who really has ever seen Garogeri Gegege or Hanatarashi? Like a handful of people. But these stories are still being repeated here 40 years later or whatever it is. So he said, that's really interesting, and I don't want to spoil the mystery that you're talking about, because it's so important. So, and I kind of thought, shit, I blew it, Because then he said, let's keep it the way it is. There's this really extreme performance style, which is one of the questions I had as I was researching this, was these people do such extreme things and they're famous for it, like the Hijo Kaidan throwing buckets of rotten fish and natto on the audience, peeing on stage. They got banned from every venue and they couldn't play anymore. So they had to start, just going into the world of recording. And if they wanted people to hear it, they had to send them outside of the country. It's almost they reached over the local scene that they had sort of, burnt their bridges, and they started reaching out overseas. So it's a very interesting way in which there's a connection between this assaultive, as you put it, like moments, which are, actually assaultive in some ways. And punk rock in Japan was not lighthearted. It was really extreme. And noise came out of that punk scene, to a large degree. That doesn't mean they were all fans of punk rock. They didn't care necessarily for that, but they were into like psych rock, like Hawkwind, and they were into a lot of really interesting electronic music. But they didn't have synthesizers and they didn't have musical skills. And so they ended up doing this other thing. Then when people heard it, somehow these stories got connected with the sounds, which if you listen to the sounds, I mean, you can kind of tell something's going on, but you couldn't really know. I mean, you can listen to bands that are supposed to be really punk rock, and then you go see them and everyone's sitting in chairs and clapping, and so what? So these Japanese guys were thinking to themselves, we really, really want to take this another step. And actually, Jojo has a great story, Jojo Hiroshige of Hijo Kaidan, that I relate in the book, where he says, we heard about Jimi Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner. It wasn't easy to get these records, right? For so long, we heard about Jimi Hendrix and what a great, insane, destructive, destroying the guitar, burning the guitar. And then we heard the music and we said, well, most of this is just normal music. There's this, except for the ends, like there's this one part where he does this crazy thing. We want to make all the music like that. So there's this way in which the imaginary of what's going on in another scene can really feed creativity and make these new things happen.
So the Boredoms really made a mark in this country. I was surprised to find out that they opened for Nirvana at Lollapalooza in 1994. A member of Boredoms, he worked with somebody from Sonic Youth, didn't he? He worked with Sonic Youth and Ween.
Oh, yeah. Well, definitely I worked with Ween closely. It was Yoshimi, I think, who did the band Free Kitten with Mark from Pavement and Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth. The Flaming Lips wrote a song where their most famous album is about Yoshimi.
Oh my gosh, yes, I've heard that. I didn't realize until I started doing research for this. That's where that comes from.
Yeah. And so they what they were a cult band and they were musicians. And so that meant a lot in the 90s because the industry did not know what to do. They were trying to figure out this underground independent music scene so they were giving a lot of freedoms that had not been given to bands before, especially Geffen Records, Reprise Records, that Warner Brothers, which released the Boredoms. And frankly, it wasn't so much the shocking aspects of the music, because at that time I'd heard a lot of shocking music, but the fact that they were on Warner Brothers was what really shocked me, people. And they were quite popular in Japan. I've seen like thousands and thousands of people at Boredom shows. And
wow.
Kurt Cobain was a unique person, right? And he loved a lot of underground music. Daniel Johnston was on his T-shirt on the cover of Rolling Stone. These are obscure people. And he would really elevate these underground musicians. He loved a lot of extreme sounds, and he really championed these groups. And so it was his insistence that brought, and Sonic Youth, turning them on. So Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon and Kurt Cobain and Ween and all these other people who were getting contracts, they were saying, well, we want these people to open for us.
Nice.
We want Pussy Galore came to Japan. And so all the Japanese came as well to see Sonic Youth, to see Pussy Galore. And they would see a Japanese band up there doing this. And they said, whoa. What's ironic about it is these American fans who were musicians, famous musicians, opened the doors for Japanese fans to learn about their own country's underground.
Would you say the 90s is the heyday for this kind of music?
No, I would say the 90s is the beginning of when people got conscious of it. I would say that now is probably the heyday of people doing it. The last 10 years, the last 20 years has been just explosive because there's so many more opportunities for people to do things. And if we could say the commercial heyday of it might have been the 90s, in the sense that you had bands, getting exposure or getting the 90s was also a time when Japan had more money, and the US was more open to, let's say, it wasn't as difficult to get a visa to come here.
Yeah.
And, Japanese people had more money to bring bands from the West and take a chance on that. And then after you lose a lot of money and you're in an economic depression, you might not be as interested. And there's been a kind of turning away from this hyper focus. America and Japan were really hyper focused on each other in the 90s. So in that way, it's kind of a heyday of the, mutual admiration club. But in terms of the music, it's happening all over the world. I mean, I go to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines all the time to do work with noise musicians there. This stuff is exploding.
Wow.
Those friends of mine in the Japanese noise scene have collaborated with my Indonesian friends who are, 30 years younger.
That's fascinating. And of course, we have the internet now, so you can get the word out and you can get your music heard much more easily.
Yeah.
This is interesting. Thank you so much for giving me all this information. It really adds another level to Ben's novel.
Oh, yeah. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good read.
Yeah, I will say, if anybody listening is interested in my book, it's free. It's on a Creative Commons license. On the website, it's japannoise.com. So everything I've ever written or done is up there for free. And that's because I get paid by the University of California. I don't make much money off of my books and things like that. So feel free to just go and grab it.
Fabulous. All right. Do you have a website? Are you on social media? How can people find out more about you besides just that?
Yeah, it's Japanoise.com. I should say Japanoise shares an N, right? So it's Japanoise, Japanoise, depending on how you say it, with a shared N, right? So Japan and noise share an N.com. And that page has all sorts of stuff on it.
Thank you so much, David. This has really been interesting and a lot of fun.
Thank you, Christy.